This is For Keeps, a podcast about collections and connections. I'm David Peterkowski. Harvey Milk, the first openly gay elected official in the history of California, once said the following about activism. I cannot prevent anyone from getting angry or mad or frustrated. I can only hope that they'll turn their anger and frustration and madness into something positive. The collector story you're about to hear is the story of one activist who spent a lifetime doing just that, transforming his frustration into action and inspiring others to do the same. And this collector's gone to great lengths to collect pieces of history that commemorate all kinds of adventures in good trouble, from those in his hometown of New York to efforts all around the world.
Do you think that homosexuality should be legalized completely a la Illinois?
Definitely.
Would you ever marry a girl who had been a homosexual?
Yeah. I think it would be more interesting.
From the Library of Congress, that's archival footage from the first ever Gay Pride March, which took place in New York City in June of 1970. And one of that event's organizers all those years ago is the collector in question. His name is John O'Brien, and since his teen years in the 1960s, he's been active in all kinds of progressive causes, from gay rights to the civil rights movement, to fighting for the rights of migrant farm workers, and much more. Originally from New York, but a resident of Los Angeles since the mid-1970s, John has devoted much of his life to being an organizer and participant in demonstrations, marches, and the like. And he even took part in the 1969 rebellion at New York's Stonewall Inn, joining other gay people to literally fight back against police harassment. Along the way, John also became a rebellion historian of sorts. As a poor laborer born to immigrant Irish parents, he felt compelled to chronicle working people's history, and, as a gay man, to raise awareness of LGBTQ history. But he found that the progressive left groups typically didn't save much in the way of memorabilia, so he has. John's amassed an exhaustive collection of historical items that help to illustrate the stories of various radical causes. Chief among his items are more than 200,000 pins, or pinback buttons as they're sometimes called, as well as tens of thousands of books and magazines, dishes and plates, keychains, whistles, postcards, membership cards, and more. Over the years, John has shared many of these items with the public by staging a number of exhibitions from his collection, which he started back in the early 1970s, in the hopes of creating a museum devoted to progressive causes. Whether or not that dream comes to pass, John remains active as an activist and as a collector, keenly interested in making people aware of the many struggles of people seeking justice, respect, and a better world. John grew up in Manhattan's Harlem neighborhood, and he became acutely interested in activism as a teenager in the 1960s, collecting his first activism-related memorabilia early on.
When I was a young teenager, at the age of 13, I was motivated by seeing pictures on television of what was being done to African Americans in the South. And so I went up to the Harlem branch of the NAACP, which was near me, and volunteered and joined them to become involved. And while they were a little startled that a poor working class white kid wanted to be involved, they welcomed me in, and I was glad for it, and began my journey as an activist. And over the years, I became more active and started to also pick up buttons to wear to advocate for those causes. So basically in New York City, most people traveled by subway. So wearing a button was a way of promoting a cause. And so I would go to various events and groups, and I'd wear their buttons to promote those things. And so I kept them as mementos, memorabilia.
In the early 1970s, John moved in with his partner, who couldn't help noticing the 1,000 or so buttons that John had held onto since becoming an activist.
he said when we moved together, what are you doing with this box of buttons? Because they were basically, I just kept the buttons from all the groups and causes I was on. And so then I had about 1,000 buttons in this box. And so I said, well, somebody should be collecting them, because the progressive left groups, they did not. They kept their newspapers and they kept their publications and books, but they didn't keep all the ephemera, all the memorabilia that they issued, like buttons and pennants and all the other wonderful things that people like, we collect. And so I said, well, someone should do it. I knew of no museum that was collecting progressive left history. And so I said, well, let me start something for myself and my goal to eventually have that. And it's been my goal ever since.
That goal may have begun with the humble pinback button, but over time, John's collection expanded exponentially, not only into all kinds of items, but into all kinds of causes as well.
I now collect materials worldwide from all periods of time. So I have stuff from the ancient, earliest periods known of human development to the present, because pinback buttons started in 1896. A woman was the one who invented it originally. And then over the years, I learned there were items long before buttons. And so it was pins and tokens and medals. My collection has everything from the earliest of ancient times to the present.
Wow.
What's kind of amazing about it is because I was such an activist, I made a lot of connections and I was a good learner. I was able to access and obtain materials from a lot of collectors who were very impressed with what my knowledge was and what I was doing. This is when there was flea markets and antique stores as the main thing. This is long before the internet, because the public internet wasn't open to the public until the mid-1990s. So all before that, for several decades, I was collecting by going to flea markets and garage sales and estate sales and joining collector groups. And now, of course, it's a banquet, which is every day you can open up your computer and you can see all those things offered. And you no longer have to travel like I was traveling for days to reach places to find items.
Uh-huh. I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier when you went up to join the NAACP. I'm curious, did your family agree with that? Were they okay with it?
Well, they didn't know. My mother was a lifelong laborer, an immigrant from Ireland, a maid, as my father, a lifelong immigrant from Ireland, and he was a janitor. So basically, I was just motivated by myself, and they didn't even know my activism until my official first arrest. When I was down south, I went down south with all these college kids on a bus, and they all assumed that obviously my parents must have approved of that, because how else would I, I was older than what I appeared. I was very tall and big and was younger than they thought. And so what I had a couple of progressives on Long Island in a group called the National Conference of Christians and Jews, who fronted for me and said I was out there with them for the summer, staying with them as part of this program to help underprivileged kids, which I qualified because I was very poor. And basically where I was instead was I was down in Alabama, Mississippi. And when they took me in, held me because their jails were filled, they put me out and with a whole bunch of other people in a stockade of this fenced-in area with no shade, deliberately to punish in the sun, no bathrooms. So we had to use the over-the-hill kind of thing. And it was all to punish us. It was a very rich, rewarding experience for me, because while I had learned and grew up suffering in poverty in Harlem, New York, in many old tenements, I got to see how people far worse than I was. And so in the shacks, etc. So it radicalized me. And so I became more committed. And it wasn't until 1966 when I was arrested in blocking the Whitehall Induction Center with 3 other young people, which got a lot of news coverage because I was then 17, that my parents learned because they had to get me out of jail. Until then, I was always able to get out of jail without my parents having to be there.
And then I guess a couple years later, you had an experience with the Stonewall Rebellion. Can you talk about that?
Well, I was one of the 4 people. I mean, basically, when Stonewall happened, I was down the street and people were running away and there was noise, commotion, and I ran towards it. And basically, I saw people there, tossing, lighting things and trying to get to the police who would then run into the bar. But what I did is I joined with 3 other people. We dislodged a parking meter from the ground and we used it as a battering ram on the door to try to get to the police. I was angry at the police for good reason, and it was our chance to finally turn the tables on people who had been beating us up and murdering us, etc. So I used my anger and tried to get to them. And luckily, the police had backup because one of the police officers escaped through the back, and she was a policewoman who called the police, and they brought the tactical patrol force to rescue the cops out of the bar. Otherwise, I would have killed them if I could. So I was big and strong and physical, and I'm a working class kid, and I had no problem with taking vengeance out on my enemy then. That was just total anger, and I wasn't alone. So the police were totally shocked and unprepared. They had never seen before gay people standing up and fighting back and learning how many more gay people that they didn't know, because I always passed. They didn't know I was gay, and nobody knew I was gay unless I said I was gay. So, but I was more than open then about being gay and comfortable and prideful. And so I took part, and I had already, prior to that, been working with a bunch of kids on the street to try to form a gay group. And so soon after that, we did. I chaired the first meeting of the Gay Liberation Front at Alternate U, which I was on the board of Alternate U then. So I arranged the space, and we had the meeting, and the rest is history. Because of the Gay Liberation Front, Stonewall became more important. It would otherwise be a rebellion that most people wouldn't even know about. But because we had an organized effort after that, and it wasn't just complaints, and then from that, we organized the annual Pride March around commemorating the Stonewall Rebellion. So it became worldwide famous. So that's why it's in the history books, because we organized and didn't just rebel. It works best when you have something that comes out of something for change that's ongoing, effective, and can make more change.
Wow. And while you're getting more active as an activist, it sounds like that's when you started collecting memorabilia relating to these various causes. Is that accurate?
Oh, yes. I grew up where there was no knowledge, identification of anything gay. It was all, if anything, there was always a negative thing only. They were deviants and perverts and deserved to die. And basically, there was nothing positive. So my first gay book was The Lord Won't Mind, which was a fiction book, but I had seen nothing or knew nothing before that. So when I saw my first gay button, I was thrilled to pick it up. I'd never seen anything like it before. And so I wore it proudly. I already had been collecting buttons because by then, this is 1969, for 7 previous years, I already had been an activist. That was one of the important things about Stonewall and me, is I had years of experience in fighting with the police and in street tactics and organizing, et cetera, and how to avoid them. And we kept it up for 4 nights because of that, because I had that experience. My name's in a lot of history books, gay history books. You can read about it. It talks about my activities. But basically, I went from being a poor laborer to being a important figure in many movements. What saved my life was basically that I cared about others. My working for other people and other causes is why I did not wind up as most of my neighborhood friends did. Otherwise, I would have wound up in substance abuse and an awful future life. But because I cared about others, I met people of other social standings and classes, and I was able to develop and grow, and still am growing from, because I learned from others. And by learning from each other, we become stronger. And being stronger together, we can help each other and help each other become and be a better world.
As John was fighting for that better world, he was also finding inspiration in those first items he collected through his activism.
My first items were around the civil rights movement, my membership in the NAACP, my activities with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, my work in the National Conference of Christians and Jews, which was a youth group in New York around civil rights. And I took part in high school for Freedom Day, organizing the school walkouts that we took place against the racism in the New York school system that then Baird Rustin was one of the leaders of. And I was one of the students who organized my high school to walk out on. So there were buttons put out, and I wore those as a kid. It was thrilling to me to have some ephemera that connected to what matters to me most. The thing about the buttons for me is it's what it represents, and that it basically signifies people's hopes and dreams, people who sacrificed and struggled to make the world better and the events they worked on. And those buttons represented that, as all the movements I took part in. I had leadership positions in the Vietnam anti-war movement. I've been active in the labor movement, in the civil rights movements, peace movements, Just Cause, the environmental. It goes on and on. It's hundreds of organizations, and for 60 years. And I'm still at it, and especially collecting. So what happened with the collecting was good, is that I was collecting this stuff when most people really didn't appreciate it. They had it, they saw some stuff, but they didn't keep the stuff. And later, those movements that I was collecting became very important, and people started to set up museums around, etc.
John says that the interest in exploring and preserving cultural histories received a big boost in the 1970s, thanks to the groundbreaking television miniseries Roots, set during and after the era of slavery in the U.S.
Roots changed a lot of things. It not only changed inside the African-American community, but many other communities who also watched that series and became appreciative of their own ancestral and ethnic experiences and identities, and started to investigate that and wanted to learn more about it. Because in America, most of us just wanted to fit in, and we didn't know much about our identities and ancestries and our histories. But these items became of interest, and so more and more people started to collect them. So as part of representing that history and ancestry, etc., that they identified with. So besides those who took part in those movements as original memorabilia, etc., many others started to, because they want to identify with those movements and what they represented for their own families and their own histories, etc.
Mm-hmm. So I want to dive into your collection a little more closely. First of all, what would you say are some of the biggest highlights in there?
Well, I'm a rebellion kid, so rebellions mean more to me, because for each collector, what the items most matter is basically a very individual, subjective basis of what's important to them. So for me, my most important ones would be around significant rebellions. So on the Roman Empire, at the time, they issued a medallion to victory over the Spartacus rebellion. Now, the slaves then did not have access to any metal foundries or printing presses or anything like that. So it was only the oppressor who put things out about these events. And so I had to collect those things to represent those events. So it's the Roman coinage that came out that I basically have an attachment to. Just like in the French Revolution, when they took down the Bastille, they melted down the metal bars in the Bastille, and they made them into coinage, memorabilia, which they gave out. And so I have from the Bastille one of the doors from the metal from that Bastille. From the American Revolution, same things. I have early committees of correspondence, medallions, the German peasant uprising. Being Irish, of course, I have all the Irish history going back. It means much to me, having identity, because part of my Irish roots is what makes me such a rebel. Obviously, on gay rights, I have early gay materials that go back to ancient times. One of the things I do is I've learned history and appreciate history and collect such. So I collect groups that most people don't even know about that were gay then or what they were doing. So it's significant to me, as I said, because when I grew up, there was nothing known about gay people that I could find. So I've made sure to go out and search and find. So early gay societies and organizations that were not even publicly gay, who I knew had gay associations.
He's also got items that he frequently received directly from the activists he encountered, including some especially big names.
I have stuff from most of the major figures. I have stuff from Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez and Harry Hay, Harvey Milk, who I knew, and many of these well-known activists who I've the privilege met, because when I grew up in New York, a lot of the old radicals were based in the little offices in New York City, labor figures and labor heroes. And so I have stuff from them that mean personal stuff. I collected personal artifacts from them, like eyeglasses, various clothings and stuff from the very famous people who gave me at the time. I said, I wanted to represent you. And I have photos of me with them and the stuff that they turned over. It's a kind of a documenting kind of thing. But for me, it's not an investment in seeing a way of turning it around to make money, as some collectors do. For me, it's a passion for wanting to share that history with others and for people to learn how much was done and what can be done to change things and change their lives. So the troublemakers, of course, are the ones who make the changes. And those ones are the ones that are precious to me, that I try to go out and collect things around, because they're important for me and making things better for me as a laborer, and they're better for the world. So it's a way to benefit personally as a collector when I not only enjoy the subjects I'm collecting, but it affects others to make my life also mean more.
Do you have a rough estimate of how big your collection is in terms of the number of pieces?
Well, of pinback buttons, it's well over 200,000. There's tens of thousands of pins. I collect about 230 different types of objects, because it's expanded over the years, dishes and plates and keychains and whistles and yo-yos and dolls and stuffed items and everything that has a message for a cause that's progressive. And so besides my newspaper and book collections and papers and music sheets and calendars and postcards and membership cards and flyers and all kinds of stuff, I don't know how many now. I assume it's probably over 300,000 items at least.
As John's collection has grown to seemingly incalculable amounts, so is the challenge of keeping it all organized.
It used to be much easier and more organized when I had less. At one time, I was actually making a 3x5 card on each item I picked up and wrote down the date, colors, the description, etc. on each, and had all that wonderful file cabinets, which I still have. But basically, along came the computers. So the libraries, of course, threw out their card systems, and I stopped buying and purchasing the cards because they went up in price. So basically, I make notes or from memory. I have basically almost a photographic memory. So that helps me with not only knowing what I'm after, remembering the stuff, but putting the things in place. So it gets more challenging. I admit now at my age that I forget collections that I obtained decades ago. And I occasionally come across them in storage areas and I went, oh, look at that, and I forgot I ever had it. And sometimes I go, well, I don't feel so bad. I was outbid on that because I've always had it. So I come across times in the auctions where I'm bidding on stuff because it's really terrific and I forgot that I have it. So then if I get outbid on it, I don't feel so bad later. And others are duplicates that I can then trade with others.
One of the joys of aging.
Yes, it's a lot of stuff. So the Riker mounts, I kept my pinback buttons in, which are like butterfly display cases. I have about close to 2,000 of those. Many, in fact, friends donate, but they didn't hold anything compared to what I needed. So I went to boxes and have names on boxes. It's more difficult to find the items. I'll have stuff under British Environmental or something like, Zimbabwe and something. So it's all separated and I have to be organized to try to keep up with it, not only to find it, but to have it in an organized way. So it's very essential for people who collect. I would advise that the better organized you are, the better you're going to not only enjoy your collection, but you're going to have a much better collection.
And I understand that over the years, you've worked with fellow collectors, some as far away as Europe, to add items to your collection. Is that right?
I have interacted with collectors around the world. So there are collector societies that are in Europe and in Asia. And of course, there are auction houses. So over the years, I was given access to auction houses that why I didn't have the money, friends would help me get the funds to get some of those items. So putting together a history of China has been a challenge, but I've been doing well at it. So it's just remarkable in some ways that, a poor little kid like me can go out there and put together a better collection than William Randolph Hearst with all his money.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing. I guess activism has community kind of baked into it to begin with, so I guess it's not totally surprising that you'd be able to lean on others.
Exactly. And being a prominent gay activist opened a lot of doors in Asia and Africa and other places by gay and non-gay people who appreciated that I opened and freed millions of people in this world who had prior to that had no futures and miserable lives. So there's a lot of people indebted, and I'm glad about that. And I take advantage of that and appreciate that and use that to add to building a collection. And it adds much to my enjoyment and my learning. And so it's a lifelong journey to learn. And it can be a lifelong journey to collect also.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of journeys, I imagine it was a bit of a journey for you as a city boy to come into the orbit of farm workers. But I understand through your activism, you became good friends with Cesar Chavez. I'm wondering, how did that friendship develop?
Well, back in 1965, I was in New York City, and I was approached by a guy named Dan Berrigan, who became famous later in his own right as a priest, a troublemaker, etc. And he was with the Catholic Worker. And I was then with the Student Peace Union. And he said they're going to have a picketing and a flyer distribution at the Macy's department store at the wine shop. Back then on the west side of the Macy's, not on the Herald Square side, they had a storefront for a wine shop, a separate entrance, etc. Well, among the wines, of course, was Schenley wines, which is what the farm workers were picketing against. And so I went there and outside distributing flyers to the people going into the stores, urging them not to buy Schenley wines. And then I went over to the ports at 4:00 in the morning to deal with the longshoremen, to urge them not to load products which were from Schenley's. And we extended that, in fact, beyond New York. In fact, eventually, we got labor unions in Germany and other countries to refuse to take the grapes and the wine products. So I became an early activist in the farm workers cause and stayed active with the farm workers. And over the years, became friends with many and know many and many famous. So Cesar, his wife was a collector of buttons, I might add. Richard, his son, is the one who devised and came up with the Aztec slogan, and I'm friends with him. So back in 1986, 87, I asked Cesar to join with me to a march on Washington for gay and lesbian rights, and he was more than happy to do it. And then I was the one who arranged him to be a speaker at that march, which he did. And so the farm workers have been longtime allies and friends of the gay and lesbian community, going back into the 60s. They were one of the first groups and unions to actually be actively supporting gay and lesbian rights. So back then in 65, there were a lot of hungry farm workers who were on strike and without clothing, without food. And the gay community in San Francisco went down and gave the facts. It meant much then, and now you can hear it in my voice. And so I'm connected to many of these labor struggles.
And then there's John's interest in the case of Oscar Wilde, the revered Irish poet, novelist, and playwright, whose homosexuality led to him being convicted of indecency and sentenced to 2 years of prison in the 1890s.
I know Oscar Wilde's grandson personally. They changed their name after his conviction, but I'm still in contact with his grandson, who is heterosexual and is not a radical like myself. But I first collected Oscar Wilde's first letter to Woman's World in I think it was 1887. And I traded that to a gay archives for another item. But that was my first Oscar Wilde item that I obtained. But I learned and I read about his work. So I was impressed with some of the things that he wrote, like he wrote a book on socialism, which I advocate and support. But he was a person out there who was brought up on charges of being gay, and the Marquis that brought him to court, of course, was part of that ruling class of British monarchs, the Marquis Queensberry and his son. But basically, what I learned out of Oscar Wilde is that he, of course, was Irish ancestry like myself and a rebel. And he learned how to speak and to share his views with. And he came to know more about himself as gay. He had 2 sons himself. He was deeply in the closet for many years, but eventually came to terms with accepting himself for being gay and learning that it's not his being gay is the problem, it's the people around him on their not accepting that. And so he became a figure for me among many Irish rebels. I have stuff on Patrick Pearse, who was the first president of Ireland. He was one of the people executed by the British with the Easter Uprising, and he was gay, as well as other gay figures and rebels that I like to associate with. But I have an extensive Irish history collection, as I mentioned. But I'm just as devoted to my Armenian collection, my Zimbabwean collection, and all the others. So it's because I see everything connected. I see that we have much more to share together than we have differences, and that we can actually appreciate the differences and diversities that can be help our lives. And all those items too. So while I started originally collecting pinback buttons, the reason I expanded to other items is because I began to appreciate those items also represented messages and ideas and people and of interest on how they were manufactured. One of the interests I had was actually learning about manufacturing and how items were made and who made them. I learned a lot about pinback buttons and the different manufacturers and who put them together. And then I went on to other objects and skills. I just have that interest. And so I learned about, printing presses, and so how postcards and various paper items are distributed, et cetera, made. So whatever you collect, it's really good, in my opinion, if you learn about the process of how those objects are made, as well as learning about the movements that created those objects.
So it sounds like activism is kind of a front row seat in the classroom of life, so to speak.
I think we can enjoy life better if we keep our eyes open and keep learning about it.
So, a bigger picture question for you. Do you only collect memorabilia promoting causes that you believe in personally?
No. I decided that to really have a thing in context that represents world history, progressive world history, that I have to collect beyond my own political favoritisms of whatever political left current I most favor. So I collect all reforms. I go back to ancient times, people who were pharaohs or monarchs of different types. Anybody who did a help or a favor that made things better in life, I try to include them. So I include some pharaohs who gave a day off of work, emperors who let people have rest, people who saved various peoples in time who were not as cruel, people who reached out, people who did the decent, kind thing that should always be done. So whatever reason they decided at the moment, I include them too. So I have 5 Roman emperors among my collection that were more the peace emperors, including Hadrian, who that famous wall was built in England about, and who also had a lover, Antonius, he named his city after. Again, there's that connection, gay and history. But I collect things that most people don't see a connection to, but that I can see a connection to over history. So, like, for instance, I myself don't smoke anything, but I collect the legalization of marijuana. I collect that stuff. It's not a major interest, but I collect it. Prohibition. I have an anti-prohibition collection, but some with the temperance side also to represent. Many causes that don't mean a huge amount to me, but I collect them anyway because they represent part of a history.
I like to think that generally speaking, there's more that unites us than divides us. And I'm wondering, do you look at what you've got and feel hopeful? Do you feel despair, a mix of the two, something else?
Oh, I'm hopeful. The collections I have show that people can change things and do change things. And that over the years, we have abolished slavery. We have allowed women to have more equality. There's still a long way to go on that matter in gender. that we treat people with respect more. There's less racism, less tribalism, less harshness. It's less that people can immediately go out and murder people or that people can enslave people. But we have overcome lots of feudalism and tribalism. The worst type of tribalism I'm talking about, where because you're of a different tribe, they would kill you. So we have a long way to go. We're still fighting and harming each other. But the collections show that we can stop that we can change our behavior, that we can do better. And it shows we have done better because over the many, many centuries, we're definitely treating and doing things better than we did centuries ago. So we have a thrilling journey to try to find the things that our ancestors and people long ago issued and made as things to remember them and what they did and for us to learn from and to do better.
Yes. I'm glad that the thrill of the chase is so potent for you still at this stage.
It's part of the fun.
Well, John, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk about your impressive collection and how it chronicles progressive activism as a whole and the various ways that activists communicate about their chosen causes. This has really been fun. Thank you for doing it.
And David, thank you for contacting me and inviting me to be part of this.
You bet. Thanks again.
Thank you, David.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, John O'Brien's desire to capture the history of progressive activism appears to be as strong as his desire to remain a progressive activist. And through those dual efforts, he's continuing to raise awareness of the many movements and people who brought about change in the past, while also inspiring changemakers going forward. For Keeps is a production of me, David Peterkowski. My thanks to John O'Brien for giving us the backstory on his wide-ranging archive chronicling the history of progressive activism in all its forms. At forkeepspodcast.com, you'll see a photo of John alongside one small subsection of his collection, an exhibit he staged that was devoted to the struggle for farm workers' rights. The show's theme song is by Still Flyin, and the closing theme is by Eric Frisch. Additional music for this episode was by Chris Zabriskie. Thanks for listening to For Keeps. Keep on keeping on.